Good afternoon. I'm Carrie Miller. I am the Program Director for the City Club of Cleveland. I am pleased to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Denise Spellberg, author of Thomas Jefferson's Qur'an, Islam and the Founders. In 1787, the Founding Fathers drafted a constitution for a new nation. Unlike previous governing documents in the New World, this constitution made no reference to God or divine providence as its leading authority. This Constitution cited the people of the United States as its sole authority. Instead of wanting to build a Christian commonwealth, this document wanted to form a more perfect union, a secular state. In order to make sure the point really hit home, the First Amendment of this document read, "Congress shall make no laws respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." This was a defining moment in our religious heritage. This set up a separation of church and state that we still abide by and occasionally argue about today. In fact, this was one of the fundamental innovations of the American experiment. There would be no national religion. Individuals were invited to practice whatever belief system their own rational inquiry led them to. It is difficult for us, nearly 250 years later, to understand how revolutionary this really was. In her book, Thomas Jefferson's Qur'an, Dr. Spellberg argues that this innovation had a particular origin in the founders' appreciation for and interest in religions beyond the Protestant faith they shared. While today, many pundits argue that Islam cannot work with democracy, Dr. Spellberg's research raises a compelling challenge to that notion, a challenge with its roots in our nation's very founding. A scholar of Islamic history, Denise Spellberg is an associate professor of history and Middle Eastern studies at the University of Texas at Austin. She holds a BA from Smith College and a PhD from Columbia University. In addition to her most recent book, she also authored Politics, Gender, and the Islamic Past, The Legacy of Aisha. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Denise Spellberg.
Thank you for that introduction. It's a pleasure to speak to you all today here at City Club about the importance of Islam and the place of Muslims in our nation's founding history. While researching my book, Thomas Jefferson's Qur'an, Islam and the Founders, I learned that Islam has been part of North American history since the 17th century. While many Americans continue to ask whether Islam is compatible with this nation's government, I think the reverse is the more pressing question. When did American democratic principles first embrace Muslims with full religious liberty and political equality? This afternoon, I will demonstrate that Muslims were included in founding 18th century precedents which still resonate. Although Muslims are explicitly included in the 18th century as emblematic of American ideals of inclusion, these founding precedents remind us that we have yet to fully realize them. In a country where Muslim civil rights and citizenship continue to be challenged, it is imperative that we understand their history and its importance. When did the ideal of civil rights for Muslims originate? Thomas Jefferson found inspiration in English legal precedents before the American Revolution. In 1765, he took note of one such ruling. It declared that Muslims were not perpetual enemies. Instead, the 17th century legal precedent stated, "Nor is there a particular enmity between them and us. For though there be a difference between our religion and theirs, that does not oblige us to be enemies to their persons. They are creatures of God and of the same kind as we are, and it would be a sin in us to hurt their persons." This paraphrase of the Golden Rule, the premise of empathy, that we should love our neighbors as ourselves, has scriptural roots in the New Testament and the Hebrew Bible. This powerful yet simple belief animated Jefferson and others before him. Around this time in October 1765, 11 years before writing the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson bought a Qur'an. The evidence? We have a note from the records of the Williamsburg, Virginia Gazette, his local newspaper. That newspaper served as the bookseller for that area of Virginia. Someone there recorded that Jefferson bought his 2-volume Qur'an for 16 shillings, just under a pound. This version of the Qur'an became known as Sale's Qur'an after the British translator George Sale. It was the first made directly from Arabic into English and was first published in 1734. Jefferson bought the 3rd edition. By this time, the book was a publishing sensation. It was translated into German, French, Dutch, and Russian. It was also by far the most accurate version then available. The subtitle of the text read, "Commonly called the Al-Qur'an of Muhammad," which suggests problems long inherent in Western Christian views of Islam. The phrase denies the Qur'an as divine revelation and implies, as most Christians in the 18th century believed, that the book was the result of the prophet's imagination. The phrase, the Al-Qur'an, which appears on the title page, idiotically meant the Qur'an, with the Arabic definite article al fused into the French for Qur'an. Sale, the British translator, added a 200-page preliminary discourse, which included a wide-ranging explication of the faith and its history, along with descriptions of key rituals and beautiful maps of the Kaaba, as well as a genealogical chart of the prophet's family. What's interesting about Sale, too, is that he never left England to learn Arabic. He is said to have learned his Arabic from 2 Syrian Christians resident in London. A Protestant and a lawyer, Sale undertook the translation for the Anglican Society for the Promotion of Knowledge, a Christian group dedicated to the conversion of non-Christians. But the translator sought a less polemical presentation of the faith, even going so far as to praise the prophet this way. He wrote, "He is richly furnished with natural endowments, beautiful in his person, of a subtle wit, agreeable behavior, showing liberality to the poor, courtesy to everyone, fortitude against his enemies, and above all, a high reverence for the name of God." For the time, this was an unusually positive Christian depiction of the prophet, one Sale chose deliberately. He also denied that Islam had been spread by the sword, a refutation of a widely held European premise. And the translator refused to condemn the prophet's multiple marriages, noting that the Hebrew prophets had more than one wife. As a result, Sale's employers cooled toward him and his translation. The 22-year-old Jefferson would have been struck by Sale's depiction of the prophet as the lawgiver of the Arabians, because he bought his Qur'an while still a law student. Unfortunately, we have no notes by Jefferson that preserve his initial reaction to the Qur'an, nor, with a terse exception, did he make any notations in his sacred text. This may be because he took no notes, or because 5 years after his purchase of the Qur'an, a fire destroyed all his books and papers. This raises the possibility that he bought the Qur'an a second time, but this is impossible to prove. Jefferson, a man of many contradictions, held negative views of Islam that were common then in Europe and North America. But as we shall see, these were tempered later in his life. For example, he accepted the wrong idea that Islam denied rational or scientific argument. He adopted this position directly from a contemporary, the French philosopher Voltaire, and we can see this in Jefferson's own handwriting. The founder followed Voltaire in asserting that Muslims only wanted to know what was in the Qur'an and nothing more. Jefferson advanced this falsehood about Islam in his early debate outlines. In trying to end the dominance of the Anglican Protestant denomination in Virginia, then the state's only established religion, Jefferson referred to Muslims in 1776 as Mohammedans, a common usage, and one that wrongly implied that Muslims worshipped the prophet and not God. The founder argued that Islam, like Catholicism, supported stifling free inquiry, and by this phrase he meant the right to question anything, including religion. Arguing before an exclusively white, male Anglican Protestant audience in the Virginia House of Delegates, Jefferson followed standard precedent, one that defined both Catholics and Muslims as religious and political threats, the subjects of tyrannical governments. In this equation, which Jefferson borrowed from popular formulations of the Whig political party, only members of the British Empire retained unique religious and political liberties. In promoting this predominant negative view of Islam, Jefferson, a consummate politician, told his exclusively Protestant audience what they already believed. However, it would be wrong to think that Jefferson's negative views of Islam interfered with his simultaneous support for the rights of future Muslim citizens, because they did not. In 1776, after penning the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson recorded these precedent-setting words. He says, "Neither pagan nor Mohammedan," meaning Muslim, "nor Jew ought to be excluded from the civil rights of the Commonwealth because of his religion." He recorded this phrase in one of his notebooks, borrowing it from one of his intellectual heroes, the English philosopher John Locke, who had first written these words in 1689 as part of his letter concerning toleration. In 1777, Jefferson's most famous Virginia legislation, a bill for establishing religious freedom, included words that he intended to be universal. He famously asserted, "Our civil rights have no dependence on our religious opinions." Unlike Locke, Jefferson advocated a form of religious pluralism without Christianity as the state's dominant faith. He declared that all free, white, male citizens of Virginia should enjoy both religious liberty and political equality. This, Jefferson asserted, was a natural right, which, he insisted, included Muslims. What is the proof of this? Jefferson's autobiography, written 5 years before his death, details his deliberately universal and inclusive intent. He recalled his opposition to the last-ditch effort to insert the two pivotal words, Jesus Christ, into the preamble of his bill. Jefferson's autobiography, penned in his own hand in 1821, records, "Where the preamble declares that coercion is a departure from the plan of the holy author of our religion, an amendment was proposed by inserting the words Jesus Christ, so that it should read, a departure from the plan of Jesus Christ, the holy author of our religion." The founder observed, "The insertion of Jesus Christ was rejected by the great majority, in proof that they meant to comprehend within the mantle of its protection the Jew and the Gentile, the Christian and Mohammedan, the Hindu and infidel of every denomination." It is worth noting that by the time he defended the infidel of every denomination, Jefferson himself had been accused of being an infidel. The term meant one who did not believe in Christianity, but it had been synonymous with the designation Muslim in Western Europe since the 16th century. Then, as now, for one Christian to refer to another as a Muslim was understood as a slur. Jefferson would be the first, but as we now know, not the last president, to be defamed by his political enemies in this way. Muslims were part of Jefferson's earliest design for the nation's inclusive ideals, and they remained so from 1776 until the end of his life. His ideas about future Muslim citizenship in the U.S. endured unchanged, despite his encounters with more powerful Islamic powers in North Africa. As a diplomat, Jefferson appreciated his country's vulnerability at a time when the U.S. had no navy and no funds to secure treaties with ruling regimes in Tripoli, Algiers, and Tunis. Morocco, unlike its other North African neighbors, became the first country to acknowledge the United States officially in 1778, remarkably early. It also became the first Islamic power to sign a treaty of peace with the U.S. in 1787. The year before, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson met in person with Tripoli's ambassador in London. According to Adams and Jefferson's report, the Muslim ambassador explained that his country's raids against U.S. shipping were founded on the laws of the Prophet, that it was written in the Qur'an that all nations who should not acknowledge their authority were sinners, and it was their right and duty to make war upon them. The Americans also recorded that the ambassador from Tripoli believed that the devil assisted his countrymen, for they were almost always successful. The ambassador's reference to the devil was hardly theologically sound in Islamic terms, for the devil leads all believers astray. But he was speaking as part of a centuries-old business, one prompted originally by Spain's invasion of North Africa in the 16th century. The Muslim ambassador told the American founders that he expected a 10% cut of the final treaty tribute if they wished to secure a peace treaty. But at the time, the U.S. did not have the funds. What moved both parties was not theology, but economics. Indeed, until the end of his life, Jefferson refused to accept that religion was the prime motive for North African piracy. But it was probably the ambassador's assertions about the Qur'an that caused Jefferson to check his personal copy, either when he returned from Europe to the U.S. in 1790, or perhaps as president in 1801, when he considered war against Tripoli. Jefferson's initials are inscribed at the bottom of a page of the Qur'an's 4th surah. There, verses describe those who fight for the faith. It is also possible that he initialed his Qur'an without regard to these verses, but this seems unlikely given his diplomatic experience and presidential foreign policy. Yet in the midst of his war with Tripoli, President Jefferson demonstrated a remarkable empathy and understanding of Muslim beliefs. In 1805, he welcomed the first Muslim ambassador to Washington, D.C. from Tunis. Because it was Ramadan, Jefferson moved the time of the state dinner from 3:30 in the afternoon to sunset. Although it's a stretch to call this the first iftar in the White House, the time change reveals Jefferson's understanding of the sacred month and his respect for the Muslim ambassador's beliefs. When the ambassador returned home, he took with him Jefferson's letter to the ruler of Tunis. Jefferson ended this missive with this unusual benediction: "My prayers that God will have you, great and good friend, in his holy keeping." The phrase is present in 2 drafts of this letter from 1806. Whatever his motives in writing this, Jefferson here acknowledges in his letter that both men are equals before a shared God. He also appears to understand the uncompromising monotheism of Islam. The final version of this letter remains in the Tunisian National Archives, but it's not unique. Jefferson repeated similar benedictions in other letters to the Tunisian ruler and in one to his then enemy, the ruler of Tripoli. As president, Jefferson attempted to assure North African naval powers that his country was not, like their European enemies, a persecuting Christian nation. This is reflected in the language of Jefferson's final treaty of peace with Tripoli in 1806, which affirms that the government of the United States of America has in itself no character of enmity against the laws, religion, or tranquility of Muslimin, meaning Muslims. As one of North America's belief systems, Islam has a genealogy that stretches into the 17th century, as far back as Protestantism. In North America, the first Muslims arrived as slaves. By 1776, Muslims of West African origin throughout the 13 colonies that would become the United States numbered at least in the thousands, later in the tens of thousands. At this time, they were more numerous than the minority of Jews, and possibly even Catholics. In the 18th century, Muslims were frequently linked to both groups as feared and despised outsiders by the Protestant majority. Although Jews and Catholics were resident minorities, ironically, Muslims were assumed to be absent by the very U.S. founders engaged in supporting ideals of American religious pluralism. This includes both Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. Thus, George Washington could write to Catholics in New York in 1783 that the bosom of America was open to receive the oppressed and the persecuted of all nations and religions, whom we shall welcome to a participation in all our rights and privileges. Washington made a point to write similar missives to Jewish communities. In 1784, he wrote from his Mount Vernon plantation that he needed a carpenter and a bricklayer. And in this letter to a friend, he enfolded Muslims into his ideal of citizenship. Washington explained, "If they are good workmen, they may be of Asia, Africa, or Europe. They may be Mohammedans, Jews, or Christians of any sect, or they may be atheists." Clearly, Muslims were part of Washington's blueprint for American religious pluralism. But did Washington or Jefferson believe that real Muslims inhabited the United States in the 18th century? They did not. Theoretically, both men embraced the ideal of their presence as equals, but they were writing about Muslims they imagined might one day be citizens, not slaves. They considered these future Muslim citizens as presumably white. Why? Because by 1790, full American citizenship could be claimed by free white immigrants, regardless of ethnicity. Here is the tragic racial limitation of both Jefferson and Washington's commitment to Muslim rights. Their embrace of slavery denied real Muslims already resident in America both their freedom to worship and any chance at the rights of citizenship. In 1774, a decade before Washington wrote about the need for Muslim workers, his list of taxable plantation items included two names. They are Fatimer, spelled F-A-T-I-M-E-R, and Little Fatima, a mother and daughter clearly named after the Prophet's daughter, Fatima. Washington thus owned two Muslim slaves, and possibly as many as four, based solely on Islamic nomenclature. Although Jefferson owned many slaves, none of their names are obviously Islamic. But that does not mean that there were no African slaves of Muslim descent on his plantations. After all, Jefferson did father 7 children with his slave concubine Sally Hemings, 5 of whom survived. Her West African great-grandmother's name remains unknown. It is not impossible, then, that Jefferson's descendants were, in reality, African and Muslim, an African and Muslim founding family. But this cannot be proved. The tension between Islam and race would play itself out repeatedly in the fledgling U.S., where lofty ideals of Muslim equality failed to embrace actual American Muslims enslaved in the country. A distinguished yet small group of American Muslim slaves became famous because of their Arabic literacy. In 1819, the Muslim slave named Omar ibn Said wrote an Arabic plea for his freedom, a cry that went unanswered. Later, he penned his Arabic autobiography. His owners presumed that he had converted to Christianity because he went to a Presbyterian church with them, but this seems unlikely. A mosque in Omar's name now stands in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Theoretical Muslim citizenship and slavery remained contradictory early American historical realities for Muslims. But where did Christian precedents for the toleration of Muslims originate? Jefferson learned much from Locke, but long before, a handful of doughty European Catholics and Protestants protested against all religious violence between Christians, then deemed heretics or dissenters. A subset of these brave souls risked their lives to extend the same tolerance to Jews and Muslims. Both, in different ways, represented an imminent presence and perceived threat to Christian society. And so both groups were frequently linked in early European precedents about religious tolerance. Let us begin with the Italian miller Domenico Scandello, Minocchio, as he was known to his friends. He told the Inquisition that Jesus commanded all to love God and your neighbor, an application of the Golden Rule he interpreted to include Muslims. He said, "The majesty of God has given the Holy Spirit to all, to Christians, to heretics, to Turks, and to Jews. And he considers them all dear, and they are all saved in the same manner. Minocchio had committed the heresy of Origen of Alexandria by assuming the salvation of all peoples of all faiths, according to the Roman Inquisition. Condemned for this heresy and many other unusual ideas, Minocchio met his death by fire around the year 1601. The ideals, not just of tolerance, but of the separation of government from all religious interference, have roots in 17th century English religious dissent. One of the first English Baptists protested to his king in 1612, "Let them be heretics, Turks, Jews, or whatsoever. It appertains not to the earthly power to punish them in the least measure." For writing this and for his Baptist beliefs, the author was condemned to die in a London prison. These assertions of an absolute separation between religion and government continued to be articulated by one of Thomas Jefferson's Baptist allies. John Leland, an evangelical preacher, fought against the persecution of Baptists in Virginia, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. Leland might have chosen to defend only those of his own Christian denomination. Instead, he consistently and deliberately defended the rights of Jews and Muslims. In 1791, he asserted, "The liberty I contend for is more than toleration. The very idea of toleration is despicable. It supposes some have a preeminence above the rest to grant indulgence, whereas all should be equally free, Jews, Turks, pagans, and Christians." Jefferson was not alone in his defense of the rights of Muslims. Keith Ellison, the first Muslim congressman in the U.S., swore his private oath of office on Thomas Jefferson's Qur'an in 2007. Ellison's election demonstrated in practice a key aspect of what Jefferson had once projected as possible only in theory. While Jefferson's imagination forecast the existence of a Muslim congressman, not in spite of his religion but because of it, he would have reeled at an African American in office. Even as a visionary, Jefferson retained the limitations of a man of his time. There is no doubt, however, that Jefferson did not envision his country as exclusively Christian, nor did a pivotal minority of his fellow founders, including George Washington and James Madison. Shortly before his death, Jefferson wrote this advice to a friend's son: "Love your neighbor as yourself, and your country more than yourself." Among his neighbors in this terse rendering of the Golden Rule, the founder most certainly included Muslims. The rights of Muslims in early U.S. history were once debated only in principle for a population the founders then wrongly deemed non-existent. Of the original triad of reviled religious outsiders in North America, which once included Catholics and Jews, only Muslims now remain the objects of a seemingly unceasing defamatory discourse that labels them or even anti-American. History compels us to challenge such claims based on key American precedents, which explicitly demand equal civil rights for Muslims. As Americans all, we should never accept less. Thank you.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we are listening to a Friday Forum with Dr. Denise Spellberg, author of Thomas Jefferson's Qur'an and Associate Professor of Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Texas in Austin. We will return to our speaker momentarily for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We encourage you to formulate your questions now, and remember to keep your questions brief and to the point. We welcome all of you here and those joining us through our primary media partner, 90.3 WCPN, 104.9 WCLV, and other radio stations across the country that carry City Club programs, and WVIZ PBS Idea Stream. Television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron. Next Friday, May 16th, the City Club welcomes David Orr, founder of the Oberlin Project, working to eliminate carbon emissions and create a new sustainable base for economic development in the city of Oberlin. For more information about our upcoming forums, to make a reservation, or to order a CD or DVD of today's program, please refer to our website, cityclub.org. Today, we welcome guests at tables hosted by C.M. Brown and H.M. Brown Foundation and the Niagara Foundation. We thank you for all your support. Today is the annual Cyrus Eaton Memorial Forum, made possible by a generous gift from the Cyrus Eaton Foundation. We thank you for your support. And today's program is in partnership with CARE Ohio, the Cleveland Council on World Affairs, and the Niagara Foundation. Thank you all for your support. Now, we would like to return to our speaker for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding the microphones today are CEO Dan Maltrop and Marketing and Outreach Specialist Kirsten Pianka. First question, please.
Professor Spellberg, you wear a number of hats, certainly an expert on Thomas Jefferson and his views, but also you are a professor at the University of Texas. I have a broad question for you that has disturbed me for many years. Most of the basic religions have very common goals, whether it's peace or helping the individual or compassion, but they all have very praiseworthy goals. At the same time, over history, there have been so many wars in which religions have bypassed those goals and have been fighting against each other. How do you account for that? How does that occur with those great lofty goals that religion has and the terrible wars that have been fought over religion?
Well, thank you for that extremely provocative question. I want to state right here that I'm not personally responsible for any of the frictions between any of the major world religions. But I'll also say this, and I think that you're right to note that there is a consistency in, even if we just take the Abrahamic religions, but we could include Buddhism and Hinduism as well, despite precepts of peace and understanding that all of these religions contain. Members of each of these religions have also found a way to make their religion work toward violence and conflict. And I think this is also about not just what's in sacred text. So, for example, the Qur'an has precepts which are very similar, if one looks through the verses, to the Ten Commandments. There are really key parallels there. But the fact is that these religious texts and beliefs are reflections of the individual humans who believe them, who embrace them, and who interpret them repeatedly, not always in the same way, and often in ways that promote friction and violence. So I think if we take these examples in context, then we can see that Christianity, which is supposed to be the religion of peace, promoted, for example, the Crusades and the Inquisition, and persecution of various types. And I could go on and on. So I don't think there's any religion that's free of this basic contradiction, which you've rightly pointed out. I think it's a question of the individual's concern and of the type of faith they want to make on earth, the type of interpretation they prefer. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your impressive scholarship. I was intrigued by the fact you mentioned that there were more Muslims than Catholics or Jews in colonial America. Is there any scholarship in terms of how they practiced their religion? I guess they're mainly slaves, from what you were saying. Did they get together and practice the Islamic religion at that time?
Thank you. That's an interesting question, and it's one that I would love to have more information on, but I don't. And I think part of the reason that we don't have testimonies from non-Muslims about Muslims worshiping as a group is explained in part by the demography of Muslims in the slave environment. So there were fewer Muslims among a general population of West Africans, and probably they were so disaggregated as not to be able to form a community. And there were dangers. There would have been dangers even if there were 3 or 4 or 5 people who could identify themselves as Muslims on the same plantation. And the danger would have been of practicing their religion openly, right? Because all of these people were the objects of their master's control and punishment. And masters were either uninterested in the spiritual welfare of their slaves, or so interested that they wanted them to become Christian. And there was therefore not a place in the understanding of these early white American slave masters for what Islam might have been. So we don't have evidence of Muslims practicing publicly, and this is one of the reasons perhaps why the irony exists that the founders who said Muslims should be part of the country as citizens didn't understand or ever connect the presence of Islam in their own country during their lifetime. It seems that Islam was obscured by race and by the lowered number of Muslims among the slave population.
Professor Spellberg, the one quotation of Thomas Jefferson that isn't too well known, that has always impressed me the most, is the one that's engraved around and above his head in the Jefferson Memorial. Reads, "For I've sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility over every form of tyranny, over the mind of man." Now, how do you think that pertains to all of this subject?
Well, I think that his hostility was toward religious and political repression of every type. And I think that he was consistent in opposing both sources of bigotry and oppression. And certainly he knew what it was like to be criticized for his religious opinions. Right after he was elected in 1800 in what has been called the first smear campaign in American presidential history, he wrote to a friend and said, "Oh, my dear friend, what a time of bigotry we have come through." Right? And in this presidential election, and in fact as early as 1791, Jefferson was compared to the Prophet Muhammad, and references to Islam permeated attacks against him as not only not Christian, but Muslim. Clearly, he knew what it was like to suffer for his beliefs. And the other quotation you could bring to the fore in this discussion is where he says, "It does me no harm for my neighbor to believe in one God or 20, I think it says, or it's either no gods or 20 gods." He says, "It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg," right? So on the one hand, he thought that religion should be able to compete on the strength of its internal construct, that it should appeal to people or be critiqued by people, and that a strong religion would hold up to free inquiry. So I think that what's interesting is, of course, that he saw religion as a series of opinions. And he tested these out. So by the time, for example, he writes to the ruler of Tunis and invokes God in that letter, Jefferson had moved from being born an Anglican, a faith he never rejected, to privately corresponding with Unitarians. And in those exchanges, coming to a belief in one God, in Jesus as a human moral exemplar, and in toleration in ways that actually parallel some basic beliefs that he may well have shared with the ruler of Tunis, primarily that Jesus was a human moral exemplar and that God was one. I think that it was his experience of seeing fellow Virginians persecuted in Virginia that never left him, and what he wished for his country was that that kind of religious factionalism and violence would never rear its head again. So I take your point, and I like that quotation quite a bit. Yes?
Thank you very much, Dr. Spellberg. It's a great review for the historical aspect of this. Did you have any chance to review, or if there was any quotation from Jefferson that he did have some reference for the Muslim in Spain? This is probably a few hundred years before all this.
Sorry, did you say in Spain?
In Spain, yes.
It's a good question. I haven't seen in his 40-plus volumes of published works to date where he mentions Muslims in Spain, but he does use the term Moor, which of course is a reference to Muslims in Spain. And his foreign policy and the foreign policy he wanted with North Africa for his country was one that was predicated in doing almost what was diametrically opposite to Catholic Spain in its persecution of Muslims, because the Muslims of North Africa remembered not just that they had been politically driven from Spain, but that the Muslims who remained there suffered all sorts of indignities, including forced conversion, the burning of Arabic texts and Qur'ans. So there's no direct reference, but I would say that it's important to remember that Jefferson didn't just buy the Qur'an. He bought books about North Africa. He bought books about the Ottoman Empire. He had a whole book on Timur-Lenk or Tamerlane. And he also had a series of interesting books that suggest he may have tried to study Arabic or Farsi or Turkish, because at the time he bought multiple volumes of works that had Arabic and then a European language translation. So some people have suggested he tried to learn Arabic. We see no evidence that succeeded. So I think, to your question, I think he was aware of the Muslim experience in Spain, but explicitly it doesn't show up in his writing.
Dr. Spellberg.
Hi.
Thank you for your historical perspective on how our forefathers dealt with people of the Muslim religion. I'd like to turn this around and ask you how Muslim societies, historically as well as today, dealt with or are dealing with minorities in their own countries, such as Christians and Jews, and whether they are exhibiting a similar attitude today as you observed our forefathers did in this country.
Well, I mean, I think the question should be taken, it's a very serious question, in two parts, and that is, in the pre-modern experience of the Islamic world, we can see that Muslims practiced an early form of religious toleration that was unique. And that is based on verses of the Qur'an about the treatment of people of the book, Jews and Christians, who had a special and elevated status in Islamic dominions. And with the assumption that once Jews and Christians accepted an Islamic presence politically, that they were allowed to keep their religion and practice it freely with some restrictions about public performance. But also, these Jews and Christians were allowed to keep their faith, and the sign that they accepted Islamic political control was that they paid an annual tax. Men paid a tax if they were sort of between the ages of 12 and 70 or something. In a way, it seems to me that this was an establishment of religion, right? There's a state religion, it's Islam. And Jews and Christians accept the domination of Islam, but they're allowed religious tolerance that was unique in the pre-modern world. We don't see that in Europe. We don't see it in China. Things begin to change when imperialism enters the Middle East and nation states arise. And that's where we see these precedents from the Qur'an and in Islamic practice eroding sometimes regarding Jews and Christians. And the presumption that Jews and Christians might be part of an Islamic polity begins to be questioned. And so, you know, various cataclysms, as I said, including the rise of the nation state, these result often in the treatment of Christians and Jews not as part of an Islamic world, but potentially as citizens with alliances elsewhere. So, for example, we see the Christian Armenians getting into trouble in Turkey, in part because of their contact with Protestants and the West. And what's interesting to remember, of course, though, is that in the long history of the Islamic world, Jews and Christians have a far better place than Muslims have in a Western society. And in fact, in the 17th and 16th centuries, when religious violence was raging between Catholics and Protestants or among Protestants, both of those groups used to invoke the Ottoman Empire and say, you know, as Christians, we would do better under Muslim rule than we are doing here under Christian rule. So the modern period, of course, has a series of aberrations and persecutions, but that's not the standard Islamic precedent. And the treatment of people of the book, Jews and Christians, there is precedent for that and for early religious toleration.
Hello, I'm with the Council on American Islamic Relations, and I wanted to ask you, I've read a paper by Dr. Ibrahim Kalin from the College of Holy Cross, and he does a long analysis of Western views on Islam. And he goes through all the various stereotypes and myths and criticisms of Islam. What I wanted to ask you about is the anti-Muslim types of things that you see in the internet today that are just absolutely ghastly and very frightening. What I've seen is that they actually preserve these decades and really like 1,000-year-old stereotypes about Muslims. How can you account for that, that after all these years of knowledge, why people still have those very deeply rooted stereotypes, and why, I guess my question is this purposeful? Is this a political campaign against Muslims? Why is this profound anti-Muslim stereotyping still being so permeated and prominent in the media and in political circles?
Well, I mean, there is certainly a history of Western Europeans of various Christian persuasions having negative ideas about Islam. I don't think that the attacks are usually new, but they are energized by people who has political motives that wish for division and that support bigotry. It partly is also a sense of where you get your information and how open-minded you are to the fact that these negative ideas are not the only ones. If we look at the example of Thomas Jefferson, here is a guy with this contradiction, right? He gets all this negative information from Europe. He uses it politically, which is not unlike today. But he's also able to tap into this discourse of tolerance and rights that was radical for the time. And he was able to make the argument that basically if you include the people you are most afraid of, then you include everyone. And that was his category of universality. For doing that, Jefferson got in huge amounts of trouble. This was not a position that was easy to take, even in 18th century America. And I think we see the same thing. The one thing I'd point out that is hopeful to me, that's hopeful in my mind in the Jefferson paradigm, is that on the one hand, you don't have to know much about Islam to support the rights of its adherents, right? So it's not as if you need to understand everything in the Qur'an and really appreciate or even like what Muslims believe, but you have to stand up for equal civil rights, regardless. So that's sort of point number one. And point number two is that this country does not educate its citizens about the fact that we are the most religiously diverse country in the world. Right? There's something called the Pluralism Project, run out of Harvard, that talks about the varieties of belief in this country. So it's not, when people bring up the phrase Judeo-Christian, even that has a history. That comes out of the 50s. It comes out of a post-Holocaust, response to anti-Semitism. It was hard for Christians to sign on to the Judeo part because Christians haven't done that well with Jews for a long time. So, people who are proposing what the religious identity of the United States looks like need to be open to the fact that this is not a Christian nation anymore. And it really hasn't been from the beginning. So anyone who attempts, I think, to make inroads against the rights of Muslims or any other minority religious group is undermining the whole structure of what this country is supposed to be about. And I think that upholding individual believers' rights is a frontal assault on this negative information. You can't eradicate that, but you can confront it for its political implications in how we live together in this society.
I just wanted to ask you about the fact that it seems that Jefferson has something common with Obama, that they both were accused of being Muslims.
Right.
And history repeats itself, actually.
Yes.
My question, I know from your scholarly experience, would you please speak a little bit about the status of women in Islam? Because there's a lot of misconception out there, and it would be interesting to see what your take on it.
Thank you for asking that very focused and narrow question. You know, as a scholar, I first studied the question of women and Islam, and I found that as a historian, what's really helpful in thinking about this question is to be really specific and to realize that at the inception of Islam, you know, and there's a debate. Did Islam give women more rights or did it diminish them? And that debate goes on among scholars. I have to say, it's not resolved. But what's important to note is that there were and there still are powerful Muslim women who contribute to Islamic society as scholars in the early period, certainly as people engaged in politics, and that is true today. I think that maybe one of the things people should consider is that clothing, modest clothing or hijab, is not a barrier to education or social participation. And if Americans and others in the West could get their head around that, maybe there would be a sense of appreciation for the fact that American Muslim women and Muslim women generally are a dynamic and diverse population. And that education for women particularly has been part of Muslim social experience for a very long time, and that it continues today. So I would also like to say that women are sort of the newest entrants into the sense of making sense and interpretations of their own faith and finding new places within it. So that's not the full answer to your question, but it's an attempt.
Hi. Thank you very much. You have affirmed my respect for Smith. There were common
Anytime.
There were common law statutes in the Commonwealth of Virginia when Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings were having babies on Monticello. Mm-hmm. Therefore, in accordance with today's standards and mores, should Sally Hemings be acclaimed as America's first black first lady?
All right. So first of all, I would refer you to a scholar named Annette Gordon-Reed, who wrote a first book about the controversy between Jefferson, the sort of study of the relationship between Jefferson and Sally Hemings, and the fact that most people were resistant to the idea that he ever had children with an African-American slave. They thought that this was outlandish and a scandal, and they refuted it until the DNA evidence proved otherwise, right? So Annette Gordon-Reed was the first person to say, no, it looks like from the historical evidence, even without the DNA, that he did, in fact, have children with this African, West African slave named Sally Hemings. Her second book is called The Hemingses: An American Family. She doesn't talk about Islam in it, which I think is sort of too bad. But what she does do is she tries to reckon with the kind of relationship that must have been, and the fact that that this was, you know, we don't know what that relationship was like, and we don't know the potential violence of that relationship or the consensual nature of that relationship, but we can certainly talk about the imbalance of power, right? If someone owns you, that's not a good start for a relationship. And if someone also refuses to free your children, I mean, he did free a few slaves, and they were related to him, presumably. He knew this, but not all of them. And in fact, he didn't free all his slaves when he died. Washington did. So to your other point, I think that, you know, this is Jefferson, the fallible human being who is, for some, just too despicable to even think about. And this is one of those aspects that's sort of interesting and contradictory about him, right? Everyone wants to own Jefferson as the icon, but there are parts of his biography that nobody wants to talk about. So, good reading with Annette Gordon-Reed.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm curious, Keith Ellison, how he got Thomas Jefferson's Qur'an under his hand that day, you know, where it had been housed. What's that story?
Oh, well, that's a great story. I actually heard him. We were being interviewed at the same NPR station, but we weren't really talking to each other. And he said that he got a letter about this, I think from a constituent who he wouldn't name, telling him the fate of Jefferson's Qur'an, which is that it is now in the Library of Congress. And this person referred him to the keeper of manuscripts, and that's how the Qur'an was present for that private swearing-in ceremony. But I will say, as a historian, it was fascinating to me that you can get your, and as Americans all, you can get your borrower's card at the Library of Congress in about 20 minutes with a driver's license and a picture. You can get the call number from the rare books collection. And you can request to sit with these 2 volumes of his Qur'an in the rare book reading room. And when I did this in 2011, I was astonished, because that was the time when people were burning Qur'ans. Remember in Florida, that crazy pastor down there? And I thought, this is a national treasure, and these people have just kind of plunked it in front of me. Bits of it are yellowing. There are little fragments coming off. Mostly the Qur'an is on display. But on the off chance that you can access this, you should probably correspond with one of the librarians there. They will, if you ask the librarian a question, they get back to you in about 24 hours. It's fantastic. But it's well worth seeing this Qur'an and realizing that Jefferson could have learned a lot about Islam if he just read that introduction to the Qur'an. But there's not a lot of evidence that he did, which is so frustrating for me. But also fascinating, because clearly by the time he was president, he knew enough to treat Muslims with respect and to include them as future citizens. Thank you.
Today at the City Club, we have been listening to a Friday Forum with Dr. Denise Spellberg, author of Thomas Jefferson's Qur'an and Associate Professor of Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Texas, Austin. Thank you, Dr. Spellberg. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and a special thank you to our partners today, CARE Ohio. This forum is now adjourned.